As an international lawyer, I was aware of the fact that we did not have United Nations permission to, or a Security Council authorization under Article 7 to engage in that operation. But in spite of that, the general view, perhaps after the fact rather than during, was that while our operation was not strictly legal, it was legitimate.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies and I'm joined today by Pitasanna Shanmugathas. Pitasanna has a master's degree in global affairs from the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs, and he has worked for many international organizations advocating for peace and disarmament, such as Save the Children, Science for Peace, Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, and Stand Canada. Now, while completing his postgraduate education at the University of Toronto, Pitasanna decided to embark on a 3-year documentary journey starting in 2019 to explore the role of Canada's foreign policy in the international arena. And he created a very, very interesting documentary that we're going to have a look at today. So, Pita, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Pita, this documentary that you made, it's called Truth to the Powerless. And I just want to show people for a second why you call it that, because on your homepage, where it's all for free, you can watch all 6 episodes for free there, you explain it in the trailer, or you let Noam Chomsky explain it. Let's have a look at this.
There is a famous slogan that we should speak truth to power. It goes back to the Quakers. And I understand and respect the sentiment, but I think it's misformulated. The powerful already know the truth. We don't have to explain it to them. The people who need to know the truth are the powerless, the ones who should overthrow those in power and move towards a more free and just world.
So that's a very strong introduction to something that I can just say is a brilliant analysis, not only of Canadian foreign policy, but of more or less NATO and the Western foreign politics. So, Pita, can you tell us first of all what made you go after such a documentary, and how did it go?
Yeah, I mean, the journey towards creating this documentary is a long one. It took 3 years just from the time that I had the idea. I was born and raised in Canada. I did all my schooling in Toronto, Canada, my undergraduate studies and my graduate studies. And in school, we kind of learned about how Canada was this peacekeeping nation. How our former Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, who introduced peacekeeping to the world as a result of the Suez Crisis. He won a Nobel Peace Prize. So, Canada's foreign policy was, very much shown in a very positive light. And, to the extent that our school was critical of Canada's foreign policy, it was really the treatment of Canada's Indigenous people, the native population. Canada treated the Indigenous population horribly. We committed genocide. We ousted them from their homes. But what our education system doesn't teach us is how when we explore this, we talk about this in our docuseries, is how during apartheid South Africa, white South African officials, they came to Canada and they looked at Canada's oppressive system of brutalizing the Indigenous people. They looked at our system and they used that as a model. The white South Africans used that as a model to institute their harsh apartheid regime, how they could govern their Bantustans and how they can oppress the black people in South Africa. You don't learn about that in school. So my education, even in my master's degree, was looking at Canada in a very rosy color light. So I then one day I come across on social media the works of a writer by the name of 𝗟𝗓𝗓, and he is a critical author on Canada's foreign policy. He's been called the Canadian Noam Chomsky. He looks at he had written an article about Lester B. Pearson, the former prime minister, the peacekeeping prime minister, and he talked about how Lester B. Pearson was this individual who supported the U.S. bombing of Vietnam. He supported the creation of Israel and the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their land. So this kind of just blew my mind open, because I always thought of Lester B. Pearson, our former prime minister, as this peacekeeper, as this peacekeeping guy. And so I then later found out 𝗟𝗓𝗓 had a book called The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy. And reading that book was like a revelation. It was just mind-blowing, because it was a collective work which had which exposed Canada's role, as a horrendous mining power around the world. How Canada would go into Latin America and Africa, devastate villages, pollute ecosystems. How we sold arms to some of the most horrendous human rights abusing nations in the world, and it was just a huge expose. So that was really my first critical look into Canada's foreign policy that I was never taught in school. I then stumbled on a documentary by a filmmaker by the name of Elaine Briere, and she did a documentary in 1996 which looked at Canada's relationship with Indonesia during Indonesia's invasion and occupation of East Timor. And Indonesia's invasion and occupation of East Timor led to the slaughter of more than 200,000 East Timorese relative to population, the worst atrocity in post-World War II history. And Canada was fully supporting Indonesia. Canada was providing arms to Indonesia. So Elaine Briere did a documentary exposing Canada's horrendous role. And that was the first documentary that was ever created that looked at Canada's foreign policy in a critical light. There was then subsequently another documentary in 2009 made by a filmmaker by the name of Amy Miller, and she also looked at Canada's foreign policy in a very critical light, and she looked at it in more of a broad scope. So looking at these two documentaries, I noticed that they only interviewed the academics and the activists challenging foreign policy, Canada's foreign policy, but they didn't interview the politicians that were responsible for formulating Canada's foreign policy. So that's when the idea first came to my head. Maybe wouldn't it be interesting if there was a documentary created which interviewed the politicians that were responsible for formulating Canada's foreign policy, as well as academics and activists challenging Canada's foreign policy. I had befriended a filmmaker by the name of Ryan Ellis. And one day, we had formed a really good relationship. One day he asked me, I'm looking to invest in a project, a film or a documentary. Do you have any ideas? And I pitched him an idea. I was like, why don't we make a documentary about Canada's foreign policy, which looks at Canada's foreign policy in a critical light, but also interviews the politicians that were responsible for formulating and advocating Canada's foreign policy, as well as the academics and activists challenging Canada's foreign policy. So, and that took 3 years to do. And this is the first documentary in Canada's history that's ever interviewed the politicians and the academics and activists. So that's the long story, basically.
Well, and that's a very good explanation, because when you wrote to me and you said you made a documentary about Canadian foreign policy, I was a little bit skeptical at first, thinking like, how interesting can it be? Because it's this peace-loving country that never does anything bad. And then I looked at it, I'm like, oh my God, I'm so wrong. You really kind of you tear away the mask of this kind of, oh, we are a NATO member, but we are kind of the polite version of the United States that only tries to help and only tries to mend fences. We never do something bad. You start in your first documentary by like showing actually the colonial past. In a sense, you're making the point that Canada is the successful version of the South African apartheid regime, right? That managed to exterminate the local population and then, project its benevolent face. Maybe this is a little bit too harsh, but you really go very systematically about this affair, and in a way I looked at it and thought, wow, this is actually basically a PhD thesis on film about Canadian foreign policy. And especially the fact that you managed to get people on board who were the decision makers is really, really revealing. I will try to show another one, because sometimes you made these people say quite amazing things, or you let them talk until they say some really astonishing things that you put absolutely correctly into context. Let me try to share another one of my tabs. This one here. And see if I can add it. Here we go. So I forgot his name, but he was a Canadian ambassador to the UN, right?
This is Canada's ambassador to Yugoslavia. His name is 𝗟𝗃𝗧.
James Bissett, Canada's ambassador to Yugoslavia. So, and I suppose he's a career diplomat, because career diplomats tend to be very, very smart people and very good at putting things into context. And you put his words and his analysis of all the illegal things that happened, you juxtapose them with what comes right after him, which is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs. I forgot his name too.
Bill Graham.
Bill Graham, right? So let's listen just to this short extract where he talks first until Bill Graham explains what he sees as what happened back in the days, or how he interprets it. Just let's give it a listen.
Article 1 of the treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was quite specific. It basically said that NATO would never use or threaten to use force in the resolution of international disputes, and would always operate in accordance with the United Nations Charter. So in March of 1999, when NATO started to bomb Serbia, that was a violation of international law, of the Helsinki Final Accords, of the United Nations Charter, and indeed of its own treaty.
As an international lawyer, I was aware of the fact that we did not have United Nations permission or a Security Council authorization under Article 7 to engage in that operation. But in spite of that, the general view, perhaps after the fact rather than during, was that while our operation was not strictly legal, it was legitimate. And it opened the door then to thinking about when is it appropriate for states to take action in the internal affairs of other states when peace and stability is threatened by the actions of those states. And in fact, that is led really to the articulation of the responsibility to protect doctrine.
So this is great stuff coming from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, saying like, oh, we were aware it was illegal, but legitimate. What went through your mind when you heard that?
We had this practice when we were interviewing the politicians, with one exception, which was Bill Graham. But for almost all the politicians, when we interviewed them, we never challenged them on anything they said. We just wanted to get the establishment view, and so then we would use what they said, and then we would interview academics and activists who would challenge what they said. By letting them speak the establishment view, we were able to hear some revealing things because we made them comfortable enough so they can just speak their minds. If we had challenged them from the very beginning, it would have made it very difficult for them to say really what was on their mind and speak their truth, so to
Yeah.
speak. So when Bill Graham said, yeah, it was illegal, but it was necessary, and we had humanitarian, intentions. I mean, yeah, it was shocking that he would just completely disregard the UN, completely disregard international law, and he's also an international human rights lawyer, so he's an international lawyer as well. By education, by Bill Graham, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So, he's basically disregarding his practice and just saying, well, it's illegal, but we felt it was necessary. And we also go into the pretense, the Canada's involvement in the bombing of Yugoslavia, the NATO bombing, the false pretense as well, and so we explore that.
Yeah, you do. I mean, your documentary actually looks at not only Canadian history up to the Second World War, although you start a little bit there, but you're going right into NATO, right? And you go into Yugoslavia, go into Iraq, kind of the support for the Iraq War, although officially it was against it, but there was a lot of foreign policy support coming for that. And then you're going also into Libya, right? The entire overthrowing of Gaddafi, and you go through this very systematically. And in a sense, it seems to me that you're having the same question as I do, which is, why does this happen from people who obviously think of themselves as doing the right thing? I think if you listen to Graham, and you do that quite brilliantly, you understand the guy probably believes what he says. It's probably not a lie. He probably thinks, yeah, this was not legal, but legitimate and necessary, and we just advance world peace, when in fact you just corroborate in warfare, just outright warmongering. What is your takeaway from all these interviews in terms of, like, how these decisions come about?
Yeah, and I mean, I think you hit the nail right on the head, which is, as you had mentioned in the very beginning of this interview, the entire sort of premise of this docuseries was that we're going to speak truth to the powerless. So we know the people in power, we know the politicians already know the truth. We know they're lying. We know, they know the horrendous nature of their crimes. Our job is to educate the powerless, the regular citizenry, about the horrendous nature of Canada's crimes, so the citizenry can rise up and challenge those in power to push Canada's foreign policy to be a more peaceful foreign policy, which they claim to represent on paper, but don't actually represent in reality. That's the whole, that was the operating premise. The powerful know the truth, the powerless don't. But when I was interviewing these politicians, I quickly began to realize that they have genuine convictions. They genuinely believe everything they're saying is true. And that was very clear when I was interviewing Bill Graham, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Bill Graham was front and center on Canada's foreign policy in Yugoslavia, Canada's foreign policy in Iraq, Canada's foreign policy in Afghanistan, Canada's foreign policy in Haiti. In Haiti especially, it was very horrendous because Canada in 2004 played a key role in ousting Haiti's first democratically elected leader, Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And I actually challenged Bill Graham. He's the only politician I actually challenge in this docuseries. I challenge him, and I tell him, Aristide would say that he did a lot of good things for the poor people of Haiti. He increased the minimum wage. He had implemented an HIV and AIDS program, which significantly combated the epidemic in the country. He had disbanded the ruthless Haitian military, which was an instrument by the United States. So Aristide would say, I did a lot of good things for the poor people of Haiti. How can you, Bill Graham, call me corrupt and dictatorial? And Bill Graham's response was, well, that's what I was informed by the Haitian people. The Haitian people told me that he's corrupt and dictatorial and he's a thug, and we did a good thing by going in and removing him from power. And he refused to hear any alternative reality. I had tried to explain to him the historical justification for why Haiti was so impoverished, the fact that France, Haiti's former colonial occupier, imposed this huge debt on Haiti in return for Haiti having its independence from France, from its former slave colonial occupier. France demanded that Haiti pay for the property which France lost. The property is the black slaves. So Haiti had to pay millions and millions and millions of dollars, and Haiti was in huge debt because of this. And this is the main reason for why Haiti was impoverished. I tried explaining this to Bill Graham, and he said, I don't know about France. I don't want to hear any of that. He was totally, refusing to listen to any alternative truth than what he believed in, and that's when it instilled in me that this guy really believes what he's saying. Off camera, had a very opening. He revealed something to me off camera, which is that he was kind of disturbed how I was grilling him on Haiti. And you can see that if you watch the episode, how much I grill him on Haiti. And he told me, do you have any idea how hard it was for us to get him out of that country, get Aristide out of that country? He's saying this as if Canada did a favor by removing Aristide, by dumping him in the Central African Republic. Canada, they secured the airport, they kidnapped Aristide, they put him on a plane, put him and his wife on a plane. They had no idea where they were going. They dumped him in the Central African Republic. And Bill Graham says to me, do you have any idea how hard it was to get him out of the country, as if we did Aristide a favor? And then Bill Graham tells me, one day I was walking down the street, and a bunch of Canadians came up to me and they heckled me and they called me a war criminal for what I did in Haiti. But I'm not a war criminal. And the look on his face, the camera is off, so he's not playing to any audience. He's he has no reason to lie. He had such a painful look on his face that you knew he genuinely believed what he did was a good thing. So, this notion of speaking, the powerful already know the truth. Towards the end of my journey in this documentary, I really began to seriously question that. I began to think that, okay, maybe the people in power, they don't know the truth. Maybe, they actually believe everything they're saying.
That is a fascinating story, seriously, and you probably should write an article or something about that, because as much as I admire Noam Chomsky for his insights, I believe it's even worse. I think the closest we got to an explanation why we are such a goddamn stupid species was given to us by Hannah Arendt, who calls it the banality of evil. And I think you can take the banality of evil way above and beyond just the Holocaust. We are, as a species, incapable to understand the implications of our actions when it comes to this large scale. And you can see how a man like Graham is probably a wonderful grandfather, probably a really a caring person, and probably somebody who thinks that what he did was good and important, but is not able to maybe put what was happening in a greater context. And nobody can sell to me the idea that George W. Bush was able to put his own actions into a greater context, right? I don't know. Are we? I hope we are not damned to just do stupidities over and over again. But watching your documentary, you on the one hand expose the fails narrative of like a peaceful Canadian history, and on the other hand, you're showing how these tragedies come about, because some of these things a lot of these wars were extremely destructive, and some people saw it very clearly, like the gentleman at the beginning, Canada's ambassador to Yugoslavia. I mean, he must have been heavily opposed to the bombings of Serbia and so on, right?
Yeah, I mean, James Bissett, Canada's ambassador to Yugoslavia, he was a very rare case of a career diplomat, somebody from the establishment who broke away from the establishment and then began criticizing the establishment that he was part of. He was Canada's ambassador to Yugoslavia, but he was, he was seeing, having been part of this establishment, the horrendous role that Canada and NATO were playing in Yugoslavia in 1999, the 78-day bombing, and he went around the country at the time and just began speaking to people, talking about what Canada's doing, the horrendous atrocities Canada's committing, bombing infrastructure, bombing news stations, just committing massive atrocities, violations of the laws of war. So he's a very rare case of an establishment politician who broke away and began criticizing the establishment he was part of. I mean, and as you were mentioning earlier, somebody like Graham, he is somebody who's been in the establishment, who's been an establishment politician for his whole life, and he's somebody who genuinely believes everything he's saying is true. But he's also, as you'd mentioned, he's a very nice person, as personality wise. He's a very charming and nice guy. I mean, he was actually my professor when I was a graduate student at the monk school. He was my professor. That's how I initially knew him. So, and he was a very charming guy, very open. He always made himself available to his students. Extremely generous person with his time, and he's this huge elite figure in Canadian politics. And the fact that he's so humble, it's extremely heartwarming. But then you juxtapose that with his horrendous politics, that he has so much blood on his hands that he doesn't even know it. And I often think, this guy, being such a nice guy that he is, if he genuinely knew the horrendous nature of his policies, I wonder whether or not, he'd probably take his own life. Just because I don't think he just couldn't connect the reality.
But these people will, if he ever gets to watch this interview here, he will obviously shake his head in disbelief and say, like, how delusioned are these people, right? How we are the ones who don't understand how great politics works, and how we are the ones who don't understand how Canada and the United States and NATO are engaged in saving the world from the great evil. And if every once in a while a civilian dies in the effort to save millions or billions, then, well, that's just it, right? Because that's the constant narrative, right? Whatever NATO does, whatever the West does, it does in order to achieve a higher goal, right? To prevent Hitlerite force from killing millions, right? NATO had to get rid of Milosevic because he was about to exterminate the Albanians. That's the narrative. NATO had to get rid of Hussein because he was about to exterminate Iraq. NATO has to get rid of Putin at the moment because he's about to exterminate Ukraine. It's the constant Hitler's long shadow over Europe, giving a reason for NATO to exist. And you're going into this question why NATO is still there. What's your conclusion here?
And yeah, you're right. And we go into very much after we explore Canada's role in NATO during the Cold War, which is very much to oppress indigenous movements in places like the Congo and Algeria. And then, after, the fall of the Soviet Union, why does NATO still exist? And it exists because it's a branch of U.S. imperialism, and that was even clear during the Cold War as well. That's the reason why NATO has always existed. It's a branch of U.S. imperialism. So when, as we talk about in this docuseries, when NATO had increasingly expanded to the east, in violation of an agreement that George H.W. Bush, the U.S. president, had made with Mikhail Gorbachev, that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east in exchange for a united Germany, which was an enormous concession on the part of Russia, considering how Germany had devastated Russia in the world wars. It's a significant concession. Clinton came in, as Bissett talks about in the docuseries, immediately violated that agreement, and soon enough, NATO had joined right up to Russia's doorstep. And the reason has always been so that NATO can act as a branch of U.S. imperialism. So, we also talk about this notion of responsibility to protect. So, and we talk about, Noam Chomsky talks about this very duplicitous nature of responsibility to protect. So, you have your UN version, United Nations version of the responsibility to protect, but you also have a NATO version of a responsibility to protect. So, and we saw this in the case of Libya, where you had a resolution, you had a UN resolution, which was to have to ensure that Gaddafi does not bomb
A
the
no-fly zone.
civilians, no-fly zone, and that was the resolution. But then you had NATO then have their own little practice, their own little resolution of where they were going to go in. It's a humanitarian mission. They were then assisting the Libyan rebels. They were then bombing Libya and ousting Gaddafi, which had nothing to do with the UN resolution. But you had this duplicitous this duplicitous nature where NATO can bystep international law, can bystep the UN, and carry out its own imperialist acts. And the reason is clear why NATO was so involved in Libya. It's because Gaddafi was setting a bad example by using his enormous resources, using his enormous wealth, and sharing that with the Libyan people. Lawrence Wilkerson, who was another establishment politician, chief of staff to Colin Powell, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. He's somebody who also broke away from the establishment. We interview him. He talks about how Libya under Gaddafi, it was doing just as well on development standards as Israel was on education, on health, on jobs. So it was doing just as well, and this was setting a bad example for other African nations and nations in the Middle East. If a country like Libya can do so well, maybe we should replicate that, nationalize our resources, kick out the U.S. and other foreign countries. And so that's why Gaddafi had to go. And NATO was this instrument, this imperialist instrument, to do it by sidestepping international law, sidestepping the UN. And that's always been the purpose of NATO. And that was the purpose of NATO in Yugoslavia as well. Chomsky exposes the reason why, the real reason why, and he cites a book by a U.S. State official, 𝗡𝗲𝗂𝗂𝘂𝘁. He writes a preface to the book, and in the book, he was a Clinton official, 𝗡𝗲𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗧, U.S. Clinton official in the State Department, and he says in the book, 𝗡𝗲𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗧 says the reason why NATO went into Yugoslavia had nothing to do with the plight of the Albanians, but we were upset over the fact that Milosevic was not adopting the neoliberal reforms of the suggested by the West at the time. Milosevic was the last holdout in Europe in that regard. So Milosevic had to go that, and the plight of the Albanians was just a pretext. And so NATO was being used as this instrument. The UN would not approve of a resolution for us to bomb Yugoslavia, so we had to use NATO as an imperial instrument under the guise of humanitarianism, responsibility to protect.
And we know all of this today. Like, there's a wonderful German documentary that came out about 10 years ago. It's in German, and the translated title is "It Started with a Lie." This lie of the Albanians being systematically killed, etc., by the Serbs in 1999, which we know was not the case. The systematic displacement that started after the bombing. After the fact. Before, what you had going on was partisan fighting of one militant group against the Serbs and so on, like and the population always fleeing these places, these villages where these fights were happening. We know that is not any kind of conspiracy theory. That is established a fact. But the narrative is sticking that NATO was helping to defend the poor Albanian population of Kosovo, and that's still what the NATO peacekeepers are there for today. Just as much as the narrative is sticking that in 2008 Russia unprovokedly attacked Georgia, we know that it's wrong. It was a Swiss diplomat, 𝗟𝗂𝘂𝗧, who did an independent commission and found out no, it was the other side. It was the Georgians who were testing the waters right after the 2008 Bucharest summit of NATO, and see how far the support would be going. And still, right now, the current German chancellor has the audacity to put out a essay in international affairs in the US, where he again repeats the unprovoked attack against Georgia in 2008. So this narrative creating that, the other guys are the evil doers. They're perfect evil. They're dictators. There's nothing that we can compromise with them. And our side is forced to go to war. We don't want it, but if it falls on our shoulders, we shall rise to the occasion. This BS is perpetrated, and the fascinating thing about what you're going into is that you come to the conclusion that a lot of the people who perpetrate it are kind of do believe in it, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, we also, foreshadow. We give a brief glimpse towards the end of episode 5 about the current Russia, Ukraine conflict, and just before I get into that, briefly talking about NATO's involvement in Yugoslavia. James Bissett asks a very interesting question. If in fact, as the politicians say, what we're doing in the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia is humanitarian, how are you going to have a humanitarian mission by bombing Yugoslavia for 78 days and nights? How are you going to have a humanitarian mission through bombing and essentially creating a greater civilian casualties than before the bombing even happened? So that's a very interesting question that he poses, which kind of challenges this entire narrative, by the politicians, that what we're doing is humanitarian, even though they may very well believe it. Now, going to what towards the end of episode 5, we talk about we talk about Russia's intervention in Ukraine. We there was a debate being held at the monk school,
Yeah.
which I was a graduate at the time. The monk school was debating, was having a debate, and the motion for the debate was whether Russia's geopolitical interests should be taken into consideration in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine. And you had John Mearsheimer, you had Stephen Walt, you had a Polish politician, a minister of foreign affairs, I believe, of Poland, a former minister. You had a former U.S. State Department official as well on the opposing side. So and we share the viewpoints of all these different speakers. And Mearsheimer talks about how the fact that the West continues to ignore the legitimate threat of the fact that a Western military alliance is right on Russia's border, the fact that the West continues to ignore that, continues to intervene and arm Ukraine, and was doing this prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is a serious threat to Putin that needs to be taken into consideration if we genuinely want to have a peaceful resolution to this war. That you can't bomb your way out of this war. The war is just going to be prolonged more and more. And an interesting fact is, in 2008, as Mearsheimer talks about, which we feature in the docuseries, when George W. Bush made the offer to invite Ukraine into NATO, Vladimir Putin at the time said, if you go through with this, we will invade Crimea. We will take Crimea. He was saying this in 2008, and the United States just ignored it because they believed what they were doing, their NATO alliance, being a member of NATO, being closely aligned with the West, is what's good for Eastern Europe, is what's good for Ukraine. They had all these notions of that our alliance, our imperialism is the best, and Russia is the foe. And that is a significant reason for why we have the war in Ukraine today, why Russia has invaded. But of course, you don't hear that in the mainstream media. You don't hear that from the politicians. You don't hear any call for negotiation. It's just send more weapons, bomb, bomb, bomb.
You're laying it out beautifully, but usually the counter argument then is, but Peter, come on, NATO is a force of good. I mean, NATO is defensive in nature. The Russians know that. Everybody knows that. NATO never does anything bad or aggressive. We are purely for self-defensive purposes. Everybody knows it. So the Russians must be lying. They're just pretending that they feel threatened. I get very upset with this, and
yeah, I mean, in our docu-series, we go through great lengths to challenge this notion of NATO just being this defensive alliance. We talk about NATO's involvement in Yugoslavia, NATO's involvement in Libya, NATO's involvement in Afghanistan, where horrendous atrocities were committed. And incidentally, if NATO is just this defensive alliance, Russia has previously expressed an interest in becoming a member of NATO, but the U.S. and the West, they strongly detest this, because if Russia is a member of NATO, then Russia has veto power, and
yes,
NATO can no longer act as this imperialist Western military alliance. NATO can no longer intervene in a country like Libya, where you have a leader that's going against Western interests, to overthrow him. NATO's days of imperialism in some degree are over if Russia becomes a member of NATO.
Here I have a question, or maybe a speculation. I wonder how long it will take until NATO has to invade its own its first member country. Because that's what happened to the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact had to invade its own members twice in order to keep them to rein them in, right? And my prediction is that we are now at 30 NATO members. There will be a moment when one of these members will do a veto on something that is so vital to the imperial interests of the US that there will be a regime change in one of its members. I wonder how long it will take until we get there. But that's at the moment, we are really seeing, as you're saying, we're only seeing clientele states of the United States inside the NATO alliance that are pretty much in lockstep. Not always exactly, but pretty much. Turkey is actually kind of playing it very dangerously at the moment by challenging NATO from the inside. We'll see how that will go down. But the notion that NATO is purely defensive, especially now that they're also having this concept of out of area, which is basically against China doctrine, and the responsibility to protect, which, as you're rightfully pointing out, is being used in order to use NATO as a spear against non-complying third states outside of the UN framework. That one is highly dangerous, and what drives me crazy is that in international relations, that's my profession, the security dilemma is well understood. That what one party perceives as purely defensive, the other party perceives as aggressive, and then you kind of you just right, you go up the scale of like militarizing your own countries, right? And still, the West is incapable or unwilling to accept the notion that we are trapped in a security dilemma, and that it is fueling the dilemma very, very, very badly at the moment, and that we are still spiraling towards even more war. Do you in your interviews with politicians, did you ever come across this notion that people actually realize that what they're doing might make the dynamics of the entire system worse?
With the politicians, they all seemed fairly convinced that their beliefs of which were very hawkish and militarist, that was the right way for Canada to go, and Canada needs to, David Pratt, who's the Minister of Defense, was Canada's Minister of Defense, said that we need to strengthen our ties even more with NATO. We need to contribute even more with NATO. He was telling me this, and so they have the strong conviction that Canada's on the right path. Well, we need to do more. We need to play an even greater role militarily in the world. Under the guise of peacekeeping, under the guise of global security. So that's what they all believed, and I think the reason why countries like Canada are able to get away, with their heinous atrocities is because, as we show in this docuseries, when we interview regular people, we not only interview politicians and academics and activists, we also go walk on the street and talk to everyday civilians, and we ask them, what are your thoughts on Canada's role that it played in the NATO war in Afghanistan. And a number of them would tell us, I had no idea Canada had even been in Afghanistan. So a lot of the people, they're just clueless to what Canada has done. And we actually asked them about whether their thoughts on why Putin invaded Ukraine. We asked people on the street this question towards the end of episode 5, and they say, oh, Putin wants to resurrect the Soviet Union hegemony, because this is what the media is telling them. This is what the Canadian media is telling them, and we expose the media and their duplicitous and their role in supporting the Canadian government, the establishment line, their refusal to actually challenge and question the narrative. And that's the reason why Canada and countries like Canada are able to get away with committing such horrendous atrocities. It's because the people just aren't aware of them.
Very well put. And by the way, I have an argument for you if you ever do a 7th episode, which is take the time to look at Mongolia. Mongolia is the counter-argument to all the establishment BS that we are being fed about Russia or China being autocracies who hate democracy. They really hate democracy. Therefore, they are trying to crush democracy. Mongolia, for the last 25 years, has been developing ever better and ever stronger democratic system, democratic institutions, with a multi-party parliamentary system, the likes of any kind of Central European system, and they are still struggling with development, but you can clearly see how everything is getting better in Ulaanbaatar, and they have very capable diplomats, and they have been doing phenomenally on this democratization, pretty much very similar to the way that Taiwan democratized after getting rid of its dictatorship, right? And you know what Russia and China do? Nothing. They do nothing because they have no problem with Mongolia being a democracy as long as Mongolia plays ball. And Mongolia is playing ball. It is kind of balancing between the two. It is cooperating with the Russians. It's cooperating with the Chinese. It's trying also to build up a third kind of neighbor policy because their biggest problem is they don't have a third neighbor. Huge country, but completely landlocked between only Russia and China. And Russia and China don't try to change the system. They don't try to intervene because Mongolia actually goes along with being a friendly neighbor to them. It has nothing to do with democracy versus autocracy. That's also why Russia has no problem with Finland being a democracy. Even during the Soviet times, the Soviet Union had no problem with Finland being a democracy as long as that democracy was neutral and kind of a ally, a neutral state, more or less on the Soviet side, right? Because it was well understood what the security role of Finland was. This narrative about democracy versus autocracy is so poisonous at the moment, and it is so stupid that really needs to be dismantled at some point. I know you're doing that too. I saw that you're going into that argument.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I think that it has relevance to the present crisis with Russia's intervention in Ukraine. Which is that I think what a solution and at the end of the day, would have to involve Ukraine being a neutral country, whereby it has relations with both Russia and the West as well. It's, some a strengthened version of the Minsk Accords, which Ukraine had violated. That would have to be some towards an end solution, which is the Ukraine is a neutral country, whereby Russia's not bothered. Ukraine can have its elections, have a sense, have democracy, have free press and all this stuff, and Russia will not intervene. The reason why Russia is so antagonized is because you had the United States, you had countries like Canada, even arming Ukrainians, providing arms to Ukraine, and this is before Russia's invasion, and for what really, what other than to prepare for an imminent invasion of Ukraine. So if Ukraine was going to be truly neutral, if it lived up to a reformed version of the Minsk Accords, Russia would have no reason to intervene in Ukraine, because Ukraine isn't posing a threat by joining any Western military alliance or forging bonds with Western military alliances.
Of course, and Russia for 8 long years did not try to incorporate the Donetsk or Lugansk into its own state territory. That was never the goal of the Russians until the 20th of February, 4 days before the invasion, because then they needed to start working on legal pretexts. But the idea was never, not even recognizing these two territories. Russia's goal for 8 years was to keep these territories inside Ukraine, because that also helps the electoral balance inside the country to be not completely Galician and pro-Western, right? So you can clearly see how Russia has a very a clear interest, but not this kind of very stupid version of recreating the Soviet Union and controlling Kiev from Moscow. So Walt, Mersheimer, all the people all these people on the right, but also on the left with Chomsky, and also even people like Henry Kissinger, they all see that Ukraine was the standard case to be a neutral country, just like Austria was in the Cold War, and very successfully so. So what frustrates me so much, and what I in Neutrality Studies try to work out, is how it happened that this failed. It shouldn't have failed. This was the obvious way to go, the obvious diplomatic way to push from both sides, and we can see the Russians pushed for that very, very hard. And it was the refusal of the West to let history develop that route that in the end made a mutually agreeable solution impossible. I don't know yet where it was, but I'm pretty sure we have to look for the answer in the West.
Yeah, it's really uncertain. So long as countries in the West, they keep supporting policies that are bringing us closer and closer to a nuclear Armageddon, which is where we're gonna end up, because nuclear powers, when they're at risk, when they feel that that their nation's sovereignty is at stake, there is a high chance that nuclear powers will react by using deploying atomic weapons. You know, there's there's an interesting case which Noam Chomsky had talked about, which is in the case of Israel, which is a nuclear power. You can't talk about it, but it is that has nuclear weapons. Israel, if it's ever, Chomsky had once said, if Israel is ever forced to comply with the Palestinian right of return, which is to allow all Palestinians to come back to Palestine, Israel would deploy nuclear weapons against the Palestinians, because Israel perceives the right of return to be a threat to its sovereignty. It's an existential threat.
Yeah.
Similarly, if we continue to keep continue to keep arming Ukraine, continuing to refuse and reject serious peace talks under this notion that Putin does not want diplomacy It's all about hegemony for Putin. So diplomacy is of no use. He does not want it. That is what the U.S. politicians. That's what Western politicians are saying. In exchange, the United States, U.S. companies the U.S. military companies have significantly profited. Canadian military companies, Western military companies have significantly profited as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So long as we continue to prolong that conflict, you increase the risk of nuclear war, because Russia is going to see this as it's going to reach a point where it's a serious existential threat, and Russia will have no choice except to deploy, to use its nuclear weapons.
Let's pray it doesn't go there. We're nearing the 1 hour mark, so I would like to ask you, Pita, what are your plans for this series? Is it done? Is it over? Or will you continue working on this project? Or is there another project in the coming?
So, Canada's foreign policy is so multifaceted, so multi-layered, that you could make 30 episodes. We only made 6, but you can make 30. You could go on forever and ever, and you could just keep unlayering one level after another. But
you should do that.
What we've put out is an essential. What we've put out is like an essential version of the main fundamental ingredients of Canada's foreign policy, but it's just so multi-layered. So this is the definitive work in that regard. We won't be adding more episodes. It's a 6-part series, but yeah.
Okay, good. So I just want to encourage you, because you're doing a fantastic job, really. This is a very, very well done series, and I do hope that it will be featured in primetime TV at some point as well, because it is very valuable what you unearth, the documentaries that you're doing. The interviews that you're doing is also a form of oral history. You're keeping the record for people later. So also the material you don't use, please keep it safe. It has historical value. And if you do one again or something else, please let us know. Everybody who's viewing this, please go to the Truth to the Powerless, right? Truth to the Powerless.com.
That's right.
Okay, in that case, thank you very much, Pita, and I hope to talk to you soon again.
Thanks so much, Pascal. It's been a pleasure.